Labeling theory, also known as social reaction theory, is basically the idea that criminal careers happen because of all the social interactions that we have with other people, and that it's all about how people treat us that determines how we label ourselves, and then determines our behavior. So this all comes from symbolic interactionism, which should not be a new term for you guys, especially if if you took the intro to sociology class. But this is the idea, and it comes from all these guys. So George Herbert Mead was a major player here, Charles Horton Cooley with his Looking Glass self, Herbert Bloomer. These are all people that were major proponents of symbolic interactionism. And so this is the idea that people communicate through symbols. So whether it's a gesture, signs, words, images, something that represents something else. So something that was otherwise neutral becomes, we give it meaning. We give it some kind of meaning. And symbols from others affect our self-image. So, an A on your paper is symbolic of intelligence or academic dedication. Wearing an expensive watch or driving an expensive car, that's symbolic of wealth. A band on your left finger indicates marriage, indicates stability. So we have attributed these things to what would otherwise be neutral symbols, but we have given them meaning. And then they affect our self-image because people treat us differently based on those things. If you get an A on your paper, your mom's all proud of you. And if you drive an expensive car, then you're going to get a lot of looks from people, and people are going to wonder how you got so much money, and they're going to maybe want to be your friend to use you for your money, which is great. But they certainly affect our self-image because they make us feel good about ourselves or not so good about ourselves. And so our behavior and our worldview depends on a couple of things. It depends on the straight up content of the messages and the situations we encounter. So there isn't a certain level of objective content in terms of if somebody says that, you're a great person or you're a terrible person. There is objective content there that will affect sort of how you feel about that person and how that makes you feel about yourself. But then there's also a subjective interpretation of those interactions. So maybe somebody wasn't actually saying something bad, but you just interpreted it that way. Or maybe they give you like a look that to them was just like, oh, they're curious about something and they just wanted to look closer. And you see it as they're judging me, or they think that I'm doing a bad job at whatever I'm doing or whatever. So there's that subjective interpretation as well, which is going to affect our behavior and affect how we think people see us, even if it's not true. And then those very much shape our future behavior, where the objective and subjective content that we get around us is going to shape how we feel about ourselves and then how we behave. So labeling theory then, it's all about things are interpretable. Everything is interpretable, including crime. So when we're interpreting crime and deviance are defined by how society has reacted to either an individual or their behavior, and then the effects that come from that reaction. So when we interpret a behavior and we say, well, we're going to label this as criminal, then that is how something becomes criminal. And so it's not necessarily defined by moral content of whatever we have determined to be illegal. It's crimes are bad because people label them as bad. And while we can all agree on why crimes can be crimes, like you shouldn't be allowed to just kill somebody or even just beat them up for no reason. You shouldn't be allowed to just, rape somebody or steal something that you want just because you want it. We agree on that, but it's because we've labeled that as bad behavior that we don't want in our society. And so we've labeled it as criminal behavior. And so it's not necessarily the moral content itself. Morality certainly leads that, but our labeling comes from, well, we have determined that this is bad, society's going to label it as bad, and then we treat it as bad from moving forward. But the difference between an excusable act and a criminal act sometimes is just a matter of legal definition. So if we look at something like justifiable homicide versus, your quote-unquote cold-blooded murder, the illegal act itself, the taking of a life that's happened in both of these situations. But in one, in like justifiable homicide, maybe you did it to save your own life or the life of a third party. And maybe you're going to be seen as, it's not only excusable, but it's laudable. You're a hero. Maybe you saved somebody's life by taking the life of somebody else. Versus cold-blooded murder, where you're just taking somebody's life for your own selfish reasons or out of anger or jealousy or whatever the motive might be. But if you compare those two, when you bring it down to the bare bones, in both situations, somebody has taken somebody else's life. But it's the context that surrounds it that gives us those defining features that tells us, well, society has labeled one of those things as not only okay, but potentially laudable, versus the other one we have labeled as, no, this is definitely criminal, and you are a terrible person, and you should be locked away. So it all comes down to how society has interpreted that, which takes into account things like context and experience and how we have labeled other similar things. It all kind of comes into play. So part of the labeling theory then takes into account the idea of differential enforcement, which means that it's not only about what we consider to be good versus bad behavior, but it's also about what kind of behavior is enforced and what kind of laws are enforced. So what kind of behavior is seen as bad enough that it needs to be enforced? And so this does not apply the same across the board, unfortunately. So the law is differentially applied, and it does benefit those with more economic and social power, and it tends to penalize the powerless. So if you have social power, you have economic power, the law is not applied to you in the same way as somebody who does not have those things. And it's unfortunate because the law is supposed to be applied the same way for everybody, that you commit A behavior, B is the result that should happen. That's the way the law was designed, but that is not the way that it is applied. And so police are overwhelmingly more likely to arrest lower class, especially minority males. And minorities and the poor are more likely to not only be arrested, but then they're also more likely to be prosecuted. They're more likely to receive harsher sentences. So differential enforcement then is the idea that the law is not applied equally. And so if you are already having some problems that affect your likelihood of criminality, being poor, we know definitely there's a relationship between living in poverty and being likelihood to commit crime. So you're already in that at-risk group, and then you're also more likely to be arrested, and then you're also more likely to be prosecuted, receive a harsher sentence. So that label is going to only make your situation worse, and then that is going to double back on itself and make that situation worse and worse, because now you're an ex-con when you get out, and so then that's another label that's applied. So the differential enforcement has a major impact on not just in terms of who ends up in prison, but also then sort of those labels that are applied lifelong, and then that affect their life moving forward. And certainly, so this kind of theory is, if we go back and remember our consensus versus conflict versus interactionist perspectives, this is definitely an example of a conflict perspective. So talking about labels, then we have part of Howard Becker's labeling theory was the notion of master status. And this is as opposed to auxiliary status. So our master status is what you would consider a person's primary characteristics. So if I were to ask you the question, what are you? You might say things like, well, I'm, a male, or I'm a female, or you might say, I'm a student, or you might say, I am a mother or a father, or I am a son or a daughter, or you might say, I am a football player, or whatever you might be. That's part of how you define yourself. All of you might say, I'm an American, because, go America. Or I'm a Montanan. But those are your primary characteristics. So that's kind of how you define yourself and how others define you as well. Often they're things people can tell just by looking at you, or like a couple of words out of your mouth, we can tell that's what you are. So master status are your primary characteristics. But then we also have auxiliary statuses. Everybody has master statuses and everybody has auxiliary statuses. And your auxiliary statuses are like your secondary characteristics. So things like your intelligence level, the fact that you're a good conversationalist. So it could be, these are basically what makes people unique and different. And so like, it might be that, somebody is really, really great at the guitar or something, but if it's not their primary profession, then that's part of their auxiliary status. So what happens then is the auxiliary statuses are what make us who we are, essentially. They're the real defining features of our character. But yet, people are blinded by the master status, and they don't see beyond that. So a very heavily influential master status is having a label of criminal. And so if somebody knows that you're a criminal, they are blinded by that and they don't see anything else. That's all they see. Another example, you might say, oh, well, he's a transvestite, or, she's a junkie. And once people hear that label, they forever view that person in that light. And it doesn't matter that the junkie plays, mean electric guitar and backed up Eric Clapton once. It doesn't matter that the transvestite graduated with honors from, with a degree in astrophysics. That doesn't matter because you're blinded by the one master status that you then use to treat that person. It's you use to define that person, and then that defines your interactions with that person. So then Edwin Lamert came up with this idea of primary and secondary deviance, which kind of takes in some of these ideas. And so primary deviance is basically any norm violation or crime that happens that may or may not have any kind of influence. If they're not caught for it, quickly you forget about it. The offender certainly doesn't see themselves as deviant, and so the offender might rationalize their behavior or see it as socially acceptable in some way, but they have committed an act of deviance and or crime. So this would be something that happens that, it's opportunistic, they take advantage of it. If they get away with it, then they're fine. That's it. That's the end of it. But what happens is that secondary deviance is what happens if that primary deviance is found out by some significant person. So by somebody in your family or by a police officer, let's say, which would be a social control agent. So then now a negative label is applied because now you are labeled as, a thief because mom caught you stealing from her purse, or you are labeled as, a property offender because a police officer caught you tagging a wall. So there are these things that if it's found out by somebody that will have an impact on your future life in some way, that negative label is applied. And so then responses from other people that affect the likelihood of subsequent crime. So this would include like labeling and stigmatizing, stereotyping somebody as a criminal. In other words, then the person develops a deviant self-concept. They consider themselves a criminal, and they're expected to drop out of school. They're expected to hang out with delinquent peers. They're expected to do all these socially unacceptable things. And so they do that. It's that self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, you expect me to do this. You're treating me like I'm going to do this. So that's what they do. They have this deviant self-concept that then determines their own behavior, because now they view themselves in this light. And if the person views themselves as a criminal, then that's how they're going to behave. And so the primary deviance was like opportunistic or whatever the motive was, but the secondary deviance comes because of that label, how other people are treating them and how that affects their own image of themselves. And those are labeling theories.